June 19, 1944. Shortly after midday. 300 feet beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea, steel groaned softly under pressure as a single American submarine slid through the darkness. In the control room of USS Cavalla, a Balao-class fleet submarine of the United States Navy, Commander Herman J. Kossler had to make a choice: surface and shadow the Japanese fleet from a distance, or close in, risk everything, and strike at a single ship whose identity he could not yet prove. Within a few hours, that decision would help cripple the last major Japanese carrier force in the Pacific and shatter what remained of Japan's naval air power. But at that moment, deep under the Pacific, Kossler faced only uncertainty, incomplete information, and the terrifying knowledge that a single mistake could mean the death of his boat and crew. As we move into this story, if you appreciate carefully researched, decision-focused narratives like this, we invite you to subscribe to Orders of History and tap the like button so we can keep bringing you the turning points that actually changed the war. Because this is not just a story about a submarine firing torpedoes. It is about one commander, one choice, and one carrier that Japan could not afford to lose. And it happened in a battle that should have been Japan's last chance to stop the American advance across the Pacific. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. To understand what was at stake that June, we need to step back. By mid-1944, the Japanese Empire was reeling. It had lost 4 frontline aircraft carriers at Midway 2 years earlier. It had been pushed out of Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands. It had seen its bases in the Central Pacific fall one by one as the United States seized Tarawa, the Marshalls, and then the Marianas. Now the Americans were landing on Saipan, an island in the Marianas that lay close enough to Japan for Boeing B-29 Superfortress bombers to fly from there to the home islands. If Saipan fell, Japan would be within reach of sustained strategic bombing. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, that was unacceptable. Admiral Soemu Toyota, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, activated what the Japanese called Operation Ago. It was their last major fleet offensive in the Central Pacific. The plan called for the remaining Japanese carriers and battleships to converge on the American fleet near the Marianas, lure the U.S. carriers into range of land-based aircraft, and smash American naval air power in a decisive battle. The Japanese had 9 carriers available, though not all of them were full-sized fleet carriers. Their centerpiece was a group of 3 heavy carriers: Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Taiho. Shokaku and Zuikaku were survivors of Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea. They were among Japan's most experienced carriers. Taiho was brand new, the pride of the fleet. She was Japan's first carrier with an armored flight deck, designed to survive bomb hits that would cripple older ships. On paper, that force looked formidable. But there was a hidden weakness. Japan had lost thousands of experienced pilots in earlier battles. The air groups on these carriers were largely green, newly trained aviators with far less combat experience than their American counterparts. And facing them was not the same American Navy they had shocked at Pearl Harbor. The United States now fielded a massive carrier force built around the fast carriers of Task Force 58. Its pilots had honed their skills over years of fighting across the Pacific. Its radar and fighter direction systems were more advanced. Its submarine force was far more aggressive and more effective than it had been in 1942. USS Cavalla was part of that submarine force. Cavalla was a Balao-class submarine, commissioned in February 1944. She displaced about 1,500 tons on the surface and more submerged. She carried 10 torpedo tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft, and could reach depths far beyond what early war American submarines had attempted. Her captain, Commander Herman J. Kossler, was a Naval Academy graduate with years of service, but limited wartime submarine command experience. Like many American skippers in 1944, he had been given a new, improved boat and told to take the fight directly to the Japanese fleet. In June, Cavalla was on her first war patrol, operating northeast of the Philippines, part of a coordinated submarine screen designed to watch for Japanese fleet movements. The Americans knew the Japanese would respond to the invasion of Saipan. They just did not know exactly when or from where. Submarines like Cavalla were the eyes and ears of the fleet. On June 18th, another American submarine, USS Flying Fish, had sighted elements of the Japanese force. On June 19th, it was Cavalla's turn. Shortly after dawn, Cavalla's radar and periscope picked up contacts, Smoke on the horizon. Masts, then hulls. The silhouettes resolved into something unmistakable. A formation of Japanese warships. But in the distorted, shimmering vision of a periscope at long range, identification was difficult and dangerous. A misidentified tanker could waste precious torpedoes. A misjudged range could leave the submarine in the path of an escort. Kossler's first task was to figure out what he was looking at. He moved Cavalla into a shadowing position, staying outside the Japanese formation, and trailing it from ahead or abeam, updating bearings and ranges as best he could. From 300 feet beneath the Pacific, with only a slender periscope and some instruments to guide him, he had to reconstruct the geometry of moving ships spread across miles of ocean. He counted ships, noted their spacing, watched the relative movement. He saw a large vessel with an island structure on the starboard side, flat-topped, with a long deck. A carrier. Through brief periscope sweeps, challenged by mirage and heat haze, he believed this was Shokaku, one of the most experienced Japanese fleet carriers left afloat. In reality, sources indicate that the target was indeed Shokaku, sailing as part of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet. Shokaku had survived multiple battles. She carried around 70 aircraft and represented a significant portion of Japan's remaining carrier air strength. If Cavalla could hit her, the blow would be strategic, not just tactical. But a submarine's mission in 1944 was not simply to sink ships. It was to provide intelligence. Even before he readied his torpedo tubes, Kossler had to decide how to report what he saw. During the critical prelude to the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the American carriers needed accurate, timely information about Japan's fleet movements. A mistaken report could send Task Force 58 hunting in the wrong direction. A delayed report could allow the Japanese to slip past and strike at the amphibious forces off Saipan. So Kossler began sending contact reports, coded messages describing the composition, course, and speed of the Japanese force he was tracking. He gave positions. He called out a large carrier. He described escorting ships. Those signals helped confirm to Admiral Raymond Spruance and his subordinates that the Japanese fleet was indeed approaching from the west, exactly as expected. But this created an immediate dilemma. Every time Cavalla transmitted, Japanese radio direction finding could potentially detect the source and send escorts looking for the submarine. Staying deep and silent maximized survival. Surfacing to keep visual track and repeatedly transmitting maximized intelligence value. Kossler's choice was to balance both. He did not simply fire a quick report and run. He shadowed. He updated. He turned Cavalla into a moving shadow that both watched and hunted. And then the Japanese did what every submarine captain feared. They changed course. The carrier group turned toward Cavalla's position. This shift converted Cavalla's trailing geometry into an approach geometry. If Kossler remained cautious and stayed at long range, he risked losing the carrier as the fleets maneuvered. If he closed the distance, he could gain a firing solution. He ordered Cavalla in. At 300 feet, the pressure on the hull was immense. The boat creaked. Valves hissed softly. The air was still and heavy. In that confined space, eyes turned again and again to their captain. The men knew he was steering them toward the center of the Japanese formation, not away from it. Above them, Shokaku's aircraft were flying sorties as part of what would become known to American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a day in which American fighters shot down hundreds of inexperienced Japanese aviators. Below that swirling air battle, an invisible hunt played out in the deep. Kossler's plan was simple in concept and extraordinarily difficult in execution. Allow the carrier to cross ahead of Cavalla's bow at a known range and angle, then fire a carefully spaced spread of torpedoes. But approaching a carrier on the surface was suicidal. Japanese destroyers ringed the formation, ready to pounce on any detected submarine. Cavalla would have to stay submerged, relying on periscope glimpses and sound bearings. At periscope depth, she was more vulnerable to detection. At 300 feet, she was blind. Kossler had to choose when to risk that exposure. He picked his moment and brought Cavalla up to periscope depth for another look. The carrier loomed larger now, bearing down, her flat-top deck stretching long and straight, aircraft spotted along its length. He refined his identification: the forward flight deck shape, the island's silhouette, the pattern of the camouflage. Shokaku. He now had range, angle on the bow, target speed estimates. Every variable fed into the fire control problem. Cavalla's torpedo data computer, a mechanical analog computer, allowed the crew to input these numbers and compute a gyro angle for the torpedoes. This device, often overlooked in popular narratives, was itself a quiet revolution. It enabled American submarines to fire from a single position into the future position of a moving target without constant visual tracking. But it was only as good as the data that fed it. Kossler had to trust his estimates, and he had to decide how close to let the carrier get. Too soon, and the torpedoes might miss or detonate too far forward or aft. Too late, and Cavalla might be forced deep by an escort before launching. He held his nerve. He pressed in. At roughly 1,200 yards, an extremely close range for a submarine attacking a heavily escorted capital ship, he made his choice. He would fire a spread of 6 bow torpedoes. American torpedoes had a troubled history earlier in the war. Faulty exploders and depth-keeping issues had plagued skippers in 1942 and early 1943, leading to missed opportunities and dangerous counterattacks. By mid-1944, most of those issues had been identified and mitigated. But no captain could ever be completely sure. When you fired, you were sending out 6 chances, 6 possible hits, 6 opportunities for mechanical failure, and 6 bright lines in the water pointing straight back to the origin. Kossler gave the order. One by one, Cavalla's 6 forward tubes roared, each torpedo sliding out into the dark water, turning to its programmed gyro angle, then racing toward the target at more than 30 knots. The crew counted seconds. They listened. They waited. First, nothing. Then, suddenly, a dull, massive boom rolled through the hull, followed by a second, then a third. 3 torpedoes had struck home. Above, Shokaku shuddered. The torpedoes slammed into her starboard side, forward of amidships. The exact placement mattered. They ruptured fuel tanks and aviation gasoline lines. They compromised bulkheads. They ignited internal fires. Within minutes, smoke was pouring from Shokaku. Flames spread as vaporized gasoline ignited along passageways and compartments below the flight deck. Her crew fought back desperately, counter-flooding, trying to control damage, jettisoning fuel and munitions. But the damage was too severe. Explosions shook the carrier as fires reached bombs and torpedoes stored aboard. Her list increased. Eventually, Shokaku rolled and slipped beneath the surface, taking with her hundreds of sailors and the majority of her embarked aircraft. For Japan, this was catastrophic. Shokaku was not just a hull. She was experience. Her surviving pilots from earlier battles had already been largely depleted, but the ship herself represented one of the last truly capable fleet carriers Japan had. She had sailed at Pearl Harbor. She had fought at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz. Now she was gone. And her loss was directly traceable to one commander's choice to close in, fire, and accept the risk. Cavalla, however, was not yet safe. As soon as Shokaku was hit, Japanese destroyers turned outward, racing toward the suspected firing position. Sonar pings began to reverberate through the water. Cavalla dove. Kossler ordered his boat down to depth, zigzagging, changing speed, doing everything possible to confuse enemy sonar and depth charge calculations. The destroyers began their counterattack. Depth charges exploded around Cavalla, each one a massive concussion that hammered the hull, rattled equipment, and sent unsecured items smashing against bulkheads. Men gripped handrails, lay flat on bunks, gritted their teeth. The psychological strain of a depth charge attack is hard to overstate. Each explosion feels like a direct attempt on your life. You do not know which one might be the one that breaks a seam or ruptures a valve. It is a waiting game with death. For more than 3 hours, Japanese escorts hunted Cavalla. They rolled patterns of depth charges across suspected positions, listening, reacquiring, attacking again. Kossler kept his boat deep and quiet, trusting in the strength of the Palau-class hull and the discipline of his crew. Eventually, the attack slackened. The destroyers, under orders to protect the remaining carriers and regroup, broke off. Cavalla had survived. When she finally surfaced again, far from the scene of the attack, Kossler could report with reasonable certainty that he had sunk a major carrier. American intelligence and later post-war records would confirm that Cavalla had indeed sent Shokaku to the bottom. Her role in the Battle of the Philippine Sea had been decisive. This battle is often remembered for its air component, the so-called Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where American fighters shot down more than 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day. But below that spectacle, submarines like Cavalla and USS Albacore, which hit Taiho with a torpedo earlier that same day, were systematically gutting the Japanese carrier force. Albacore's torpedo started a chain reaction aboard Taiho that, due to poor damage control practices and gasoline vapor buildup, eventually led to an internal explosion that sank Japan's newest carrier. Cavalla's 6-torpedo salvo removed Shokaku. In one day, Japan lost 2 heavy fleet carriers and hundreds of trained and semi-trained aircrew. These losses could not be replaced. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Imperial Japanese Navy never again mounted a truly coordinated carrier air offensive. Its surviving carriers would appear at Leyte Gulf later that year, but largely as decoys, almost empty of planes. The age of Japanese carrier power in the Pacific was over. And yet, when we trace the thread of how that happened, we find ourselves back in a cramped control room, 300 feet below the surface, with one man weighing options. Stay safe and simply report. Or press in and attack. What makes Kossler's decision especially striking in retrospect is that he had already fulfilled his duty as a scout. By sending timely and accurate contact reports, he had done what higher command needed most. He had confirmed the location and composition of the Japanese carrier group. From a purely cautious perspective, that could have been enough. He had provided the information. The fast carriers of Task Force 58, with their hundreds of aircraft, were the primary tools for sinking enemy carriers. But submarine doctrine by 1944 did not view boats like Cavalla as passive observers. They were expected to hit targets of opportunity, especially high-value ones. Kossler's choice to attack did not merely remove one carrier. It also forced Japanese escorts to break formation, divert attention, and focus on anti-submarine warfare at a critical moment in the larger battle. Every depth charge they dropped on Cavalla was a moment they were not screening effectively for American air attacks. Every emergency maneuver they made undermined cohesion. From a macro perspective, Cavalla's attack was one piece in a vast mosaic. Land-based American air from the Marianas, carrier strikes, submarine patrols, radar-directed fighter intercepts. From a micro perspective, it narrowed down to seconds. How long to expose the periscope above the waves? Exactly when to fire the first torpedo? How close to allow the carrier to come? How deep to dive under counterattack? What if Kossler had misidentified the ship? What if the target had been a lesser vessel, or even a neutral or friendly ship misread under pressure? What if he had lost nerve and fired from too far away, leading to misses and a wasted opportunity? Or what if a destroyer had spotted Cavalla's periscope and rammed or depth-charged the submarine before she could shoot? Those what-ifs remain open questions that underline how contingent many historical turning points really were. What did happen is clear. One submarine, on its first war patrol, commanded by a captain making split-second judgments, delivered a precise, lethal blow to a key enemy carrier. And that blow fell at the exact moment when Japan most needed every surviving carrier deck it still had. In the epilogue to this story, it is worth remembering the scale of what naval warfare in the Pacific had become by 1944. Thousands of aircraft, dozens of carriers, hundreds of escorts, oilers, submarines, armadas spread over hundreds of miles of ocean. In that immensity, it can be easy to think of individual decisions as minor, almost irrelevant. But again and again, the historical record shows us moments where one commander's choice under pressure rippled outward into the grand narrative of the war. Commander Herman J. Kossler received the Navy Cross for Cavalla's attack on Shokaku. The submarine herself would go on to serve through the war, and later as a training vessel. Shokaku remains on the bottom of the Philippine Sea, a steel tomb, and a silent marker of the day when Japan's remaining carrier strength began to collapse. As we reflect on this, there is a deeper question we can carry forward. When we look at the outcomes of battles and campaigns, do we see only the big arrows on the map? Or do we also see the human beings deep inside those arrows, making choices with incomplete information, under pressure, in cramped rooms, at odd hours, far from any guarantee of success? If stories like this one help put the human decision back into the center of the history we all think we know, then that is exactly the mission of Orders of History. If you want to help us keep digging into the single decisions that changed entire campaigns, we invite you to subscribe, share this episode with someone who loves real history, and join our community of viewers who refuse to settle for surface-level narratives. Did you know about the role of USS Cavalla and the sinking of Shokaku in the Battle of the Philippine Sea before this episode? Let us know in the comments. Because the more we uncover and share these turning points, the clearer the past becomes. And the clearer the past becomes, the better we all understand the true cost and meaning of the decisions made in war.